going through, please feel free to stop me. As Doug said, I am married to an educator. Been married 21 years, so I've been with him from being a teacher to him becoming a principal to him becoming a superintendent, and so I've seen a lot of that transition as well from a personal standpoint, and we'll kind of talk about some of those examples as we've encountered them since him becoming a superintendent as well. So first what I wanted to do is just give you a little bit of background about me so you kind of know where my experience has come from. Oops. Did it not go through?
Huh.
Oh, I think you.
Do I have to hit that link to hit the rest of them?
They were there.
It was there, somebody erased it.
No. Slide 34.
Is it
It
there?
looks like it's like locked on the side of it, like I can see it, but it doesn't look like it would come through on the presentation.
Well, click with the mouse on that link and they'll all come up. Here.
I mean, I can wing it, I just,
That's what I'm saying. There's
I
so
have it all in
many
front of me,
they're not-
it's just, if you guys want to visually see it while we're doing it.
That doesn't go. See how they were there?
The slide is skipped while presented.
Sorry. I didn't really look at that. Why he is doing that, I don't necessarily
Here,
need
hold
this
on.
slide.
If you just give me a second, and then you can refresh. Go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say, to give you a little bit of information about myself, I have my bachelor's degree from Doane Crete in business administration. And at that time, they did not have a human resources emphasis. I had to do a self-designed portion of that in order to get that, I guess, on my resume. At this point, I think they've changed their curriculum, and so you can actually get just an HR degree. With that, then, before I graduated from college, I actually got a job there locally at the Nestle Friskies Pet Care Plant. It did change over to Nestle as an HR assistant, which I'll talk about in a minute. But through them, they had tuition reimbursement, so I thought, hey, why not? I'll go back, get my master's degree. And my master's degree is also through Joan Lincoln, the Master's of Arts in Management program. And I decided to stop there. I thought 2 degrees from Doane was enough for me, even though Chad is working on his 5th. From there, I also have a certification from the Professional and Human Resources Certificate from the HRCI Institute, and then also the Society for Human Resource Management. I have that certification as well. Are they needed in my job today? Probably not. If I ever probably wanted to come work in Lincoln or Omaha, it probably would be really helpful to have something like that. Is it working?
We're getting there.
So at Crete, at the Friskies Pet Care Facility, as I started my HR career there, actually before I graduated from Doane, a lot of that was just introductory stuff. That was a union facility, you know, and in education, obviously you got the teachers union, so I'm well familiar with how the union environment works. Along with that, I was able to kind of start in an assistant position and work my way into more responsibilities there. So when I first started, I did a lot of the introductory stuff. Thank you. I don't like doing it too well, so I appreciate it. All right. There we go. So there's the Friskies Pet Care information. We had about 400 employees at that location, and I did everything from payroll to the newsletter to working on union grievances, kind of got my first taste with that and how to respond to those. From there, Chad got a principal position out in Kimball, Nebraska, which I'm from Potter originally, so that was only 30 minutes from my parents, so it was a great move for us to be out there closer to my family. We were out in Kimball for 5 years, and at that time there was not an HR position available, so I took a job with the Chamber of Commerce as their executive director. I was there for only about a year, and then a HR position did come up with a local tri-state cooperative. And so we had locations in Wyoming, Colorado, and Nebraska. So not only did I need to know all of the Nebraska laws and regulations, I also had to know Colorado and Wyoming as well. And in that position, I got to wear a safety hat as well, so I did a lot with drivers and all the good things that go along with that, as well as just some credit management on the office side. It was a very small company, only 85 employees, so I had to wear a lot of hats in that particular position. From there, He took a principal job in Seward, Nebraska. That was in 2007. And I was fortunate enough to find a position in Seward, and I've been there ever since. So I am the Human Resources Manager at Hughes Brothers. We are a manufacturing company, and we are also union there as well. In this role, it's a little bit different because I do have a strong support staff of some other functions that work with me. So we have a separate environmental and safety manager. So it's nice that I'm not solely responsible for all that, even though I'm heavily involved in the workers' compensation side. He takes care of all the safety meetings and all the EPA regulations and all those kind of reports that have to be turned in on a quarterly and annual basis as well. In addition, I have a full-time payroll coordinator that works with me as well. So like I said, I'm more of a generalist now and oversee a lot of those functions. I'm not going to click on the factory tour now, but if you had a chance, it's just a quick 2-minute video about what we do at Hughes Brothers. We manufacture transmission and distribution materials. It's kind of interesting because not a lot of people realize Seward, Nebraska is responsible for most of the power lines that run across the state of Nebraska. So that's what we do. One of the interesting things too, as I was working through this, since I have been there almost 11 years, I thought, I want to look and see how many different people have I hired and separated in that time frame, just to kind of give me a little bit more, I guess, of a baseline here. So in that time, I have hired 155 employees over the last 11 years and had 178 different separations, which was a lot more than I thought it was. You don't remember from year to year how many different people you go through. We peaked at 306 employees back in 2012, and we're actually down about 275 employees right now. But we are very busy. Anytime there's an ice storm, a hurricane, a fire, a lot of those natural disasters unfortunately drive our business as well. Just like you have a lot of different probably positions within your school district. Some are custodians that don't need degrees, some do need a degree. And so same with us, we look at lots of different things there as well. I'm not going to go through all of those. But what we're talking about today, and what I guess you've been studying today, is just looking at human resource management in general. So what does that all encompass? Not only in your school, but in any business, the policies, the practices, the procedures, all those systems that are in place to help you get from point A to point Z successfully. And I know that can change in every organization because you do have to find what works best for your school district or your business or whatever that might be. Obviously, there's going to be certain things in place, like how you have to handle overtime, because the Fair Labor Standards Act says this is how you have to do that. So there's those other things that you have to be aware of, and making sure they're working within what your personal mission statement, vision statement, your goals are for your teachers and your staff members. So I kind of put it in, what's my top 10 list? Again, this is not all-inclusive. This is probably where I spend a majority of my time. And so we're going to talk about each of these things a little bit more in detail. Again, if anybody has questions, suggestions, stories that you want to throw in, please feel free to do that as well. So from an employment and recruiting standpoint, and I put this as number one, just because, first of all, employees are our greatest assets. If we do not have the right people in the right places, as some of you probably have read that story, the bus is going to go to the wrong place, right? So that's one of the things that I think that is important to spend a lot of time on is how do you recruit and fill those openings that you have. I like to use a structured interview process, and what I mean by that is I have the same set of questions that I use with every applicant that comes in the door. And that might get tweaked a little bit depending on the level of education that person might need, what the responsibilities are. Obviously, when I hired a vice president controller position, I had a lot more involvement from other key players in that particular interview process than I do with a welder that I'm hiring or a machine operator that I'm hiring. But I still use a lot of the same questions from the entry-level position that I do to the CFO. For example, some of the situational questions give you a good feel of their background. Whether it is, tell me about a conflict that you've had with a coworker and how you resolved it. Everyone has assets and liabilities, strengths and weaknesses. What are your 3 strengths? And give me examples of how you use them. Obviously things that you all probably are using today. But it's good to find some situational and hypothetical questions to make sure you're gaining some of that information as well. And a consistent practice is also going to help you avoid discrimination should you ever be faced with that. Especially if you have, a person who thinks they're qualified for that role and then you end up not hiring them. how are you gonna defend yourself if they do potentially file litigation against you because they felt they were the best qualified candidate for that position? So something to think about. So there are some do's and don'ts, some illegal questions that you cannot ask. I did include with one of the resource folders, I think that you put out there for them, a couple examples of legal and illegal questions. And I bring that up because, you know, some people just don't maybe always realize that there are certain things that you cannot ask in an interview. You know, obviously some of the key areas, disability, age, nationality, religion. I do find it interesting though that being through this with Chad, going through a superintendent interview, one of the things that kind of caught me off guard when we went and interviewed at David City is they did say, you know, bring your family, your wife up for this process because we're going to have time to, you know, meet with everybody. And I'm like, how can they do that? They can't ask you if you're married, you know. And so I kind of had a little bit of a, you know, why are they doing this? And he's like, no, you're coming with me because it's going to make a difference to know that, you know, we have kids that are going to be in this school system and that we have a vested interest in the school district and things of that nature. So sometimes it's hard for me to shut my HR brain off because there are a few things in education that are a little bit different. However, I'm sure it was just more an optional thing. If you are married, bring your wife and your kids so they can participate in this. As you well know, when you're hiring teachers that are married potentially, you want their family to like that area so they stay there for a while, but you can't legally ask them, are you married? Another example of this is when we moved to Seward, I actually just recently found out that I was expecting our third child. Well, I was not about to tell them in an interview that I was pregnant. I mean, I wasn't showing obviously, but the thing is as much as we want to say that it doesn't impact a decision, it does. If you're hiring a teacher and that teacher is, you know, 7 months pregnant and is going to miss the first 3 months of school, that's probably going to impact your decision. But should it? You know, you want to make sure you're hiring the best candidate for that job. And you cannot, because it's illegal for you to discriminate against a pregnant woman. So, I mean, those are some of the things that you have to think about is you do have to make sure you're still finding the best candidate for that position. Any questions or anybody else have any situations that have come up like that before?
What about arrest record?
In education,
In your
you do
case?
have a little bit of an exemption there.
Is this a personal question?
Well, no, it was listed
No,
on there, and I was like, I
I-
know we asked, I know
Yes.
that's on their application, so
It
I know
is,
that.
and that is one of the main differences
Not mine.
between education and the business world, is that you obviously, because you're dealing with children as your primary business, you do have a right to at least have the background check done. Now, you have to be careful in how you actually might ask some of those questions as well, because definitely if they've had any felonies or any activity that involve that, I mean, that's obviously disqualifies them from employment. So yes, that is one main exception to that. Now, I will tell you that one of my hiring practices is that I do a background check with every candidate, but that's after I've already offered them the job. So post-offer, I can do the physical, the background check, the drug screen, all of those things, but I can't do that before I make an offer. So, but again, a lot of times it's a lot of money invested in that process, but again, I think it's critical because I have had, you know, probably a dozen people over the last 10 years that didn't pass their pre-employment drug screen, you know, and I'm glad that I spent the money to have that not become a problem in the workplace. So good question.
So you can
Anybody else?
withdraw that offer if you
Yes.
go?
Because when I sit down and meet with an employee, I tell them, and they sign off that their offer is contingent upon them passing their pre-employment drug screen, their background check, and their physical. So they actually sign a document for me before I set those appointments up, so that I can revoke that offer. So, and I don't know that you have to have it in writing, but it definitely makes that process a lot cleaner, should they try to argue, you know, that point. You know, and there's been a few people that didn't pass the drug test that are like, well, can I apply again next year? Well, you can apply, but I'm probably not gonna, you know, hire
The
you.
same drug
You didn't
test,
pass it
yeah.
the first time, you know. So it does raise a challenge for that. So, anybody else on that?
Any of those documents she's talking about, you have them on Blackboard in a zip file? So-
Yeah, and like I said, one of them is not even mine, it's from another university, but it had a really great way to show you what is a legal way to ask that question. For example, you can't ask somebody how many work comp injuries they had last year. But you can say, tell me about your personal safety record and how do you feel about safety? I mean, you can find ways to ask questions to still gain information about them. One of the other things I think that's helpful too, when I have managers actually sitting in on the interview process with me, I tell them write quotes, not notes. So when we go back and look at what that person might have said, it's a better way for you to remember that that's actually how they said it to you. Because if you're interviewing, like in my case, I interview sometimes 10 or 12 candidates to try to hire a couple of welders. After a while, they kind of mix together a little bit. So write quotes, not notes. Not your interpretation of that necessarily, but what they told you in an interview. For example, you know, if you're interviewing a candidate, especially a teacher or somebody, they may come out and say, oh, I'm married and I have 3 kids and things like that. So they can tell you that, but again, you cannot ask any additional questions based off of that information. And technically, you can't use that information to discriminate against that candidate for the job either. So a lot of information may come out, but again, as long as it's not a question that you've illegally asked, then you're okay to know that information. Yes?
You may have this in here later, and if you do, that's fine, just
Okay.
answer it then, but in your experience, what have been a couple of the best questions that you've asked, and you've got some connections to education. So what would be some of the best interview questions that you've asked over the years that would also apply to us hiring teachers or people, educators?
Let me think on that here for a minute, because I do have a variety that I use. Like I said, I like to ask a lot of questions about how they handle conflict. You know, because really, not only in the classroom with kids, I mean, and you could probably come up with some hypothetical situations where, you know, you have a rowdy kid and you know, what kind of processes would you follow to try to keep discipline in your classroom, you know, if it's a teacher that you're hiring or something like that. You know, how do you get along with your coworkers? So I do ask a lot of that. Another thing that I ask about is, like in my situation, are they a team player? What characteristics do you have that make you be a good team player? Those kind of things. I'm just trying to think of some unique questions for you.
And that was one of my, I guess one of my questions too,
Yeah.
was the way you just phrased the last one, because if you ask the question, are you a team player?
Right.
Invariably they say yes.
And that is always the key, is to try and phrase your question so that you get an expanded answer, not just a yes or no question. I mean, because otherwise it's hard for you to really get that person's characteristics or their personality or how they're going to be able to handle some of those situations. And that's why I said, even like on the strengths and weaknesses question, I pose it as, you know, assets and liabilities, what are your 3 strengths, and give me examples how you use them. Not just tell me, oh, I'm you know, dependable, I'm loyal, and I'm trustworthy. Well, okay, but explain on that, expand on that, because it does give you more insight when they're able to give you an extended answer on some of those situations. Did I have a question back there? Okay. Other than that, you know, a lot of times too in our situations, do you like to work alone? Do you like to work with others? How do you get along with others? What kind of people do you find it most difficult to work with? What kind of students do you find most difficult to manage in your classroom? I mean, that's a way that you can ask questions on how you deal with it. How do you handle a teacher who's not completing their goals and objectives? You know, you can, depending on what kind of position that you're hiring for. How do you handle 2 students fighting in the hallway? You know, make it be that they're able to give some expanded answers on that, if you will. Because obviously discipline, classroom discipline is a big component of education and some of those things as well. Coaching, if you're looking at people for coaching, I mean, there's probably some questions you can throw in there about their coaching style or how they manage team dynamics. A lot of different things like that. What I did not do, and I can send to you, Doug, is I'll send you a couple of my interview templates that I use for different positions. That way that'll give you guys some of those questions. I didn't think to include that, so just remind me if I forget to send that to you.
I always ask questions about attendance. But you had said, like, you can't ask how many work-related injuries, so you can't ask, well, how many days were you absent last year?
The way you phrase it though, I mean, you can say, can you tell me about your attendance history of work? It's okay because it is important to know attendance. It's just that if they tell you that they were gone because they had cancer last year and they missed 6 months of work,
Right.
it's kind of hard to stay away from taking it the next step. But I think attendance is important, and I think that's one of the ways that I usually phrase that, is trying to think, and again, my template will have a couple of those on there. Because obviously attendance is important for us too. I think you can even word it that way. Obviously attendance is an important part of this position. You know, tell me about your attendance history at work, because you're not asking were they ill, were they hurt,
Yeah.
were they whatever. You definitely have to find what are those key elements that you need in that position and focus your questions around that. And you know, if you Google out there situational interview questions, behavioral interview questions, you can find all kinds of examples out there to help you figure out how to word some of those questions that you're looking for. There's all kind of free sites out there. And I do have on one of my slides a couple of those resource tabs, I believe. But SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, it's a very cheap membership, and you get sample job descriptions, you get sample policies, you have a not Snapchat, I'm sure they probably have that too, but a blog situation, and I get like emails every day where people can just go out and post a question and other people respond to it. And it's only like $199 or $189 membership for a year. So it's a really great investment. Plus they also have attorneys on staff that you can send a legal question to. Obviously in education there's a couple of key people you're working with already from an education standpoint, but definitely something to think about. A good resource out there. So training and development also is an important part, and you know, obviously you guys do a lot of staff development throughout the year, so there's key things that you're always hitting on. Same with any business environment. Obviously there's certain topics that OSHA requires us to cover every year, personal protective equipment, bloodborne pathogens, safe lifting techniques, those kind of things. Probably some of the same things you probably cover with your staff members potentially on some of that. Probably even more so, how do you handle critical elements or a shooter in the workplace? You know, a lot of that, like I said, you don't want to think about, but you need to be prepared for. And so hopefully you've got some safety teams in place that do talk through some of those situations. Keeping records and documentation is also critical, no matter if it's job performance, training, whatever it might be, because sometimes you do have to go back and prove that you did train somebody on a particular topic. And it seems like it might be keeping a lot of documentation, but document. I can't stress that enough, no matter if it's the business world or the education world, having that documentation is key, especially, for example, career development plans or performance plans. More so in your case if you have a teacher, a tenured teacher who is not performing to your expectations, and you have to figure out whether or not you're going to be able to retain them on your staff. Well, obviously, you can't just fire them, right? You have to be able to prove that you gave that person an opportunity to correct their behavior first before you take steps, especially in a union environment. So a lot of times you're going to put that staff member on an action plan that they have to be able to reach those attainable goals, and how are they going to do that before you can take that next step. So again, a lot of that falls into not only documentation, but what your plan is for that person in order to be successful. Obviously, you know, I always tell my managers, we're not going to set anybody up to fail. You know, if we're going to put somebody on an action plan, it needs to be reasonable, attainable goals. Because sometimes they come in just wanting to fire somebody, and I'm like, whoa, hold the bus. You know, we're not just going to jump into that, because is the problem on how you're managing that person? Or is it because that person really can't do the job anymore? And to give you an example of that, when I first started at Hughes Brothers, it was probably into my first or second year there, we had a purchasing assistant who had been there for 23 years, doing pretty much that job the entire time. And her manager, the purchasing manager, had been there maybe about 3 years, because she's only been there about a year and a half more than I had. She wanted that gal fired right then and there. And so we kind of talked through what are the challenges, what are the problems. And we did end up doing an action plan with that person, because we did find there were some deficiencies there on how the job needed to get done. So we set those timelines up, and that employee chose not to meet any of them. She basically just said, I'm not doing that. So in that case, we did end up separating her from employment, even though she had been there 23 years, because she chose to not change her behavior based on the reasonable goals that were set for her, or the reasonable job, I guess, expectations that were set for her. So they do work. I mean, and again, in education, like I said, I know you've got some different hoops to go through if you do have to fire a tenured teacher or something like that. But again, it's all about the documentation and how you get from the beginning to the end of that, making sure that you're doing it fairly and equitably and legally, first and foremost. So compensation and benefits. there's a lot of points on this, because obviously there's a lot of different things out there that impact us. I mean, most of us aren't probably just gonna go to work if we don't get a paycheck, right? I mean, most of us need that paycheck. It's not all about the money, but yet it is, right? I mean, if we don't have the right component of benefits for employees, they're not gonna wanna stay at our place of employment. And that doesn't mean that everybody can be competitive in every area. But, I mean, I think one of the advantages that I see, especially in the world of education, is especially in the state of Nebraska, you guys are able to all be under the Educators Alliance, whatever the plan is. So you have, 10,000, 15,000 lives on your insurance policy, which really makes it better for your schools, because that's a bargaining chip when you go to negotiate your health insurance. Where me, right now, I'm kind of looking at, do we join a captive program so that we have more lives? Because we had a lot of people absent last year, and we're facing a 20% increase in our health insurance renewal for this year, which is huge, compared to what it's been in the last year. I think there was a 0% increase this year for schools coming in. So, I mean, that's, like I said, you just never know what's gonna happen based with your employment, but obviously benefits are key. With this, I think the other thing to do is making sure that the policy, or the benefits and the things that you have in place fit the needs of your employees, and are there things that you can do that aren't gonna cost your district any more money? That I don't know, because you guys have to be within a certain budget, right? So there's certain things that you're not able to just throw out there, because you do have taxpayer dollars and you have a set budget that you have to work with. In a business environment, especially a for-profit business, you don't have as many limitations, because you have a little bit bigger pocketbook to draw from when you're trying to determine what those benefits are. I think the other thing that I would say for this area is educate your employees on what those benefits are, because I think that's usually what the downfall is for any businesses. A lot of the employees don't fully understand how all those benefits work. For example, I'm pretty sure does everybody in the schools have an education or an employee assistance program, right? But not everybody always realizes what that is and how that can help them. And I think, that is one resource that I think too, even in my workplace, gets underused. And we always try to do paycheck stuffers to remind people that that's there, or if somebody comes to me with, they've got this situation going on at home, for example, somebody's going through a separation and possibly a divorce, something like that. I always remind them, use your EAP benefit. It's confidential. You and your family members, if there's kids involved, they can go see a counselor free of charge and help them through this situation if need be. Under this too, job descriptions, job analysis, job evaluations. Obviously, I think it's pretty much a requirement that you have to do a staff evaluation of all your teachers. Is that once a year, twice a year? I can't remember what your, depending on who it is. Okay. One of the things that's important too, if you do have to let go of a staff member down the road, do you have a job description in place for that? Do you know what those performance expectations are? So again, whether that's for-profit, nonprofit, education, that's also a key component that you need to make sure that you have job descriptions in place in order to help you evaluate what it is that you need to be doing there. Other than that, anybody else have any unique benefits that you have in your district that maybe aren't in other districts that you would want to share? Okay. Like I said, there's a lot of different things that go into this. Moving on then is to compliance issues. And with that, as I was talking earlier, I'm sure educators, I know Perry Law Firm or whoever you work with, and another one is pretty much your two in Nebraska, which obviously you want to use somebody that's well familiar with the education world. We have somebody that we work pretty closely with at Hughes Brothers too, Klein Williams, based out of Lincoln and Omaha. But yeah, if you don't know a good attorney, you want to find one. Because there are definitely going to be situations where you want to just make sure that you are actually taking the right steps. I mean, if you have a bad feeling about a situation, trust your gut on that. Get an attorney involved, network with the other people, and just say, hey, this is my situation, what would you do? And I do that a lot with my network people too, because one of the things is somebody out there has faced the same situation as you before. You're probably not the first one to have to go through that. So networking is really key when it comes to that. And so, I mean, there's a lot of organizations that you can join. I'm sure there's probably the superintendents meet, the principals meet, so that's a great time to network. as you saw on the resources, I had found a quick article on all of the things that Trump had signed into law in the last year. And I know not all of them were true laws. I just found that interesting just because I know, looking at what the legislature is doing right now, obviously there's a couple of key things out there that are gonna potentially impact education, depending on what happens with those. But compliance is one of those things that, I think it's more difficult every year. I mean, I've been doing HR 20 years now, and you think it'd be easier after 20 years, but I think it's more difficult than ever. I mean, even in schools, you've got the bullying and the social media. I mean, my goodness, I would not want to go back to high school today, I'll just say that, right? Because I don't know how I would do it with Snapchat and all these other things that they have going on. I run it into the workplace too. Even with adults, I feel like I'm running a junior high school most days because it's still, people fight with one another and they come in and they're like, well, so-and-so posted this about me on Facebook, and I'm like, I'm not getting involved in that. One of the situations where, it was pretty defaming what was said, and I'm like, you can go to the police. We don't have any policies internally right now at Hughes Brothers, which is something I've been trying to change, but we're a family-owned business, and our owners are very old school. They just don't want to be involved in any kind of conflict. But if there are certain things, I just tell people, if you feel it's that big of a threat, then go to the police. If they felt there was something on Facebook. But it does make it difficult. Any of these social media things, people are not supposed to be on their phones at work, but I'll have somebody come in and say, well, they posted this at 2 o'clock, that was when they were working. So it just creates a challenge, just like cell phones in the classroom. I think from the time probably when Chad was first a principal in Seward, they at first had a policy about no phones in the classroom at all, and it was the keep them in your locker to all that, to now it's pretty much teachers embracing them in the classroom, and how do you utilize them so that they can learn. Kind of neat tricks. I know one of the teachers has a little pocket thing on their door, so as they walk in, every student has to put their cell phone in a pocket, if they're not using in there. So I know it makes it challenging for all of you as well, so it's no different in the workplace either.
I have a question.
Yes. Sorry.
I have heard, I don't necessarily agree with it, but that a person that I know in the HR said that if you don't have a policy, that makes you less liable.
Yes and no. It's kind of what they say about handbooks too. If your handbook's not going to be up to date and really with what you're doing, you're better off not having one because you're not following what you actually have in writing. So it could be set true, if you look at it that way. But what I would say is that if there is something that's critical or something that you get faced with, it's probably better to have the board think about putting a policy in place to help address it. The problem is once it's in black and white, then you're bound to follow it exactly like it says.
No, we don't want to do that.
So that's the thing is, can you as a staff figure out how are you generally going to address that issue? Because that's probably more important, that everybody is enforcing whatever the rule is consistently. And that's a challenge that I have too, because I have, I'm trying to think, 25 different foremen for all the different groups that we have, and I think that's one of my biggest challenges is consistent, equitable enforcement in every department. We have a list of shop rules because we're a union environment as well, and we do have a policy in place about no cell phones, but I can guarantee you when I go walking through the plant, first of all, when people see me, they start scattering because they're like, crap, here she comes, right? But, if somebody has their cell phone out and I see it, I normally go right up to them and I'm like, what are you doing? I normally just give them that general warning, put it back away. If I circle around and I come back and that person's still on their cell phone, well then I'm probably going to write them up because they know they're not supposed to have that. But again, how do you address that? It's different. You had a question too.
Well, I was just going back to that, in the education side, I'm seeing more issues with discipline on the social media.
Mhm.
It's not happening during the day, but because of what's happening, so I'm thinking with employees. And it creates a hostile and an unsafe, or if an employee comes to you and says, someone's making these threats, I don't feel safe, how do you address that if it's a hostile work environment?
If it gets to that situation, then it would have to be more of an investigation would need to be conducted.
Okay.
Because, especially if there's probably more to it than the social media post in that case. Especially if somebody would come to me and say that they feel threatened or unsafe, especially if it's two coworkers that both are there. Because then, yes, it's raising more than just an issue for those two people, but potentially the whole department or the whole company in situations like that. And so, again, I would open up an investigation, probably have to talk to each one of them. Not so much focus on just what the social media posts were, but are there any activities that have happened at work that lead them to feel that they're unsafe or they're in a hostile working environment? Because people, unfortunately, like to throw out that they're being harassed. I mean, yes, and I hear that term even at work with adults, I'm being bullied. Well, what kind of behavior do you see? Is it just because you guys have two different personalities and you don't get along, and you don't like how they're talking to you? Or really, what is bullying? And I'll tell you, it's difficult to define sometimes, because it all comes down to tolerance. You know, it's just, and one of those things that when I meet with new employees, and we're walking through both the contract book and our handbook, one of those policies that we have is about sexual harassment. And, you know, again, what's the general rule of thumb there? Well, it's hard to really do that because her level of tolerance and mine might be a lot different. If somebody's telling dirty jokes over there, she might be offended, but I'm not. So how do you deal with that? And so I think sometimes what you have to look at is what is offensive to somebody and what is reasonably offensive to somebody. And it might be that it's different. If that person is strictly religious, you know, they don't like any of that, they can be offended and still come in and file a claim and me have to address it. But I usually tell people, if it's not something that you say or do in front of your mother, your grandmother, your pastor, you know, something like that, should you really be doing it now? I mean, and again, I work in a manufacturing environment, so there's a lot of profanity on the floor, I'll be honest, because people will come into me and they're F-bombing this. I'm like, and I just kind of have to say, stop. Okay, I don't want to hear the F words or whatever in my office. I mean, I still go on and have that conversation, but unfortunately, that's how they talk all the time out on the plant floor. So again, it creates a different environment for me, because obviously in schools, you guys are going to have policies in place that they can't use the profanity in the classroom. But it does make it hard to deal with, because it's hard for me to determine what's always reasonable in that situation. And sometimes that investigation will flush out from witnesses what actually might have happened. It's difficult. It is difficult. We do have security cameras in our facility too, but they're not covering every square inch of our property. So again, if there's something more of a physical altercation, or you know, there's something that might have happened, sometimes I can go back and look at security cameras, which a lot of schools now have those too, but you can't hear what's being said, it's just pictures. So sometimes it helps you, sometimes it doesn't. The best thing is to ask, were there any witnesses, or where are you at, and go around and ask some of the people in that environment that maybe didn't realize they saw something, can they help you with that investigation? When you figure out how to handle that, I'd like to know, because it's, you know, it's a, you know, I wish I had a crystal ball and a magic wand, I'll be honest, because I think that would help us get through a lot of those situations. You know, even with President Trump coming into office, you know, again, just getting back on the benefits side, you know, he's been trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act and how all of that works, and he's not been successful. If any of you have been following the news the last, you know, 18 months or whatever it's been, there's still going to be components of that still in place, that you're going to be required to report to your employees what that insurance benefit is, those 1095Bs, 1095Cs, those kind of things are still having to happen. I don't know how many of you have to do anything with that right now, but essentially, you know, you're still required to take that piece of paper when you file your taxes to show that you have health insurance right now. So that may still change coming up in the next year. It sounds like some of the penalties and fines have been waived already for this year if you don't have insurance, but it's hard to keep up with. You know, I try to focus on just what I have here, and I try to run out and refresh myself for the presentation, because again, I get so tunnel vision on just what impacts us at Hughes Brothers that I don't always look at what's happening in the rest of the world and things like that. And only because Chad's coming home talking about these education bills that are on the table that I even really understand what you guys are potentially faced with, especially with, you know, cutting administrators' pay to a certain percentage, and how, you know, like in David City, you know, they're talking they would have to basically cut all, I think there's 11 administrators between their special ed director up to where he is. They either have to cut everybody's salary in half in order to meet that threshold, or they would have to, I think, let go of 4 administrators. You know, well, that's, how is that reasonable? You know, again, I'm probably biased too, just like you, because education's important, but it's just really interesting to see how that impacts different things. One of the things that we are a member of at Hughes Brothers is the Nebraska Chamber of Commerce. And that's something too that as a school district you could consider, because one of the nice things that we get usually every day is an email board, and then I also get every week a legislative report. and kind of a bill tracker, because they have people there who are paid members to kind of follow the bills and kind of give more information on what's happening. So like, for example, I know this coming week here on education, they've got a couple of the bills that they're gonna be discussing. So it's just kind of interesting, and I can kind of pass those around to look at if anybody wants to see them. But kind of something is, in your school district, if you have a lot of things going, especially OPS, LPS, I'm guessing you guys might have lobbyists that work, with, okay. Because definitely it's a bigger impact for your school districts. Anything else on compliance issues before I move on? Again, a couple of those local, and even state and Nebraska, state and federal resources. If you just go to the departmentoflabor.gov or the dol.nebraska.gov, you're gonna find a lot of those required postings that you have to have. One of the things that I want to talk about too is the Fair Labor Standards Act before I move on to the next thing. How many of you have bus drivers who are also custodians? Okay, a couple of you. So one of the things to keep in mind with that, and I don't know if everybody always looks at this, but technically you have to make sure that you're including all of their hours in one paycheck. You can't just pay them over here for the bus driver and pay them separately for the custodian, and if they work 60 hours, not pay them any overtime. And so one of the things to consider is the law says that any time after 40 hours in a work week needs to be paid at time and a half. So again, kind of one of those things that you may not think about, but again, when Chad became a superintendent, I got a lot of phone calls from him that first year just as he was looking at all of the things that he was in charge of, and that was one of the ones that he happened to catch, is they were not paying those staff members correctly that were both bus drivers and custodians, because they were treating it as two separate jobs rather than as one employee. So, something to think about. We've talked a little bit about this already, counseling, discipline issues, making sure you have that proper documentation, completing an investigation if needed, as we were just visiting on that, and then succession planning. Maybe in education it's not as big of an issue because it's not a clean-cut plan for everybody, because obviously if a teacher leaves, you're gonna replace that teacher. In a business environment, it probably becomes a little bit more critical, because if I have my vice president controller pass away, do we have somebody behind him or her that could step in and do that job if need be? We have a lot of people in our organization that have been there. I think I have 15 people that have been there 40 or more years. And so I have, and probably at least 30 people that have been there over 25 years, at least in the office environment. So I have a lot of key people retiring in the next 3 to 5 years, a lot of supervisors. And so from a planning standpoint, because what we do is so unique, you can't go out and get a degree in what we do at Hughes Brothers when we manufacture our parts. So one of the things I've been trying to convince my owners is, let's hire a management trainee for these 5 foremen that are going to retire in the next 3 to 5 years, because it's going to take a good year to 2 years for them to really gain the same amount of knowledge that the person before them has. But again, it's kind of one of those things that you have to look at what are your goals for the organization, and not every position needs a succession plan. If I got an accounting clerk and that person quits tomorrow, you can go hire another accounting clerk. It's going to be more your key positions that you definitely want, a plan in place if you can, how you're going to handle that. Again, an education that may or may not apply in some of your areas, but it is definitely something that we look at in the business world. One of the fun things I do get to do, since like I said, everybody kind of scatters when they see me coming, it's just like being a principal, and I'll be honest. It's hard to explain to our 3 kids who are now, 15, 13, and 10, when they were a lot younger, what I did. And so I just kind of told them, I'm the principal of Hughes Brothers. If somebody gets in trouble, they come see me. If somebody needs help, they come see me. So one of the fun things I do like to do is, when employees have birthdays, we do a little birthday gift for them, so I can go out on their birthday, tell them happy birthday. We did a lunch container one year this year. It's a nice insulated mug. But again, I like to have some positive things that I get to do too, instead of always being the bad guy, because I do feel like sometimes, just I'm sure like you do as a principal, you always are having to bear down the bad news or crack the whip or whatever it might be. So it's kind of fun to find some fun things to do every now and then, whatever that might be. Time and attendance, again, probably with your cooks, your custodians, things like that. Hopefully you've got some timekeeping mechanism in place in order to track those hours, since that is a requirement for those non-exempt positions, that you're able to prove some kind of record of their time? And what are your policies with attendance? I know, as you've asked before, attendance is obviously very important, especially in a bus driver position. You're not gonna be able to have somebody that's gone a lot in that type of role. And policies with attendance, you know, the one thing with a union environment like mine, I do like that it's so black and white, because I have a lot of, unfortunately, people that have an attendance problem from time to time. It's pretty easy to fire those, because it's three strikes and you're out, basically, verbal warning, written warning, 3-day suspension, termination. So if they can't figure it out by then I don't get too worried about saying bye. Thanks for being here, but we're gonna move on, so. Terminations, resignations, we already talked about documentation. As I said, make sure you're following all your policies. You basically, you know, CYA in all situations there, right? To make sure that no legal ramifications are gonna come back on you. And sometimes, no matter what you do, you still may have that lawsuit filed against the school. Granted, I think they have to go, before the board sometimes and do a appeal or a hearing first before something would happen. But in my situation, I've had a few disgruntled employees who left that had filed either EEOC complaints, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, that felt that they were being discriminated against. In one situation, she had performance and attendance concerns, but after the fact, evidently she had dyslexia and had a learning disability, which we never knew anything about. She never reported. She had no issues with doing her paperwork in her job. So again, after the fact, she came in and said we were discriminating against her on a couple of different bases. Plus, she was over the age of 40, so we discriminated her on the basis of her age too. So sometimes you just have to, you know, follow that. And luckily, that one didn't get to court. We were able to win that through the EEOC process, but she still gets that right to sue letter. Every time somebody leaves an organization, they have that right to sue letter. The other thing that's important about documentation for you is that that person will go and file an unemployment claim, because, you know, once they're out of your employment, they are eligible to go file for unemployment. The key there is, if you fired somebody for cause, you are not liable for those unemployment expenses. That comes out of the state coffers, and if you can show that you did terminate someone for cause. Even if somebody quit, unfortunately, it usually comes back to your unemployment code, but again, that's another key, that if somebody files for unemployment and you did terminate them, make sure you have the documentation in order to prove that. Any questions on that?
Well, I just have a question, you know, knowing the demographics of Seward, and then you talked about the manufacturing business. Has the demographics changed of bilingual or ELL? Do you have challenges with language barriers, and what have you had to do, if so, as human resources, to ensure that your hirees are able to be effective on the job if they do not speak possibly English?
We in Seward are actually kind of in a bubble there, that we do not have a lot of applicants even that are necessarily bilingual or speak a different language than English. And the Seward as a whole in that district is kind of that way. Now, David City, where I live now, I mean, we have a lot more. We probably are 50% free and reduced lunch. We have Schuyler kind of next to us, so there is a transient population there with that. But when I did work in Crete, there was more of that there. And so, not so much there at Nestle, but when I did my internship at Farmland Foods, they actually had like 20 or 25 different languages spoken within that plant at that time. And so when they did new hire orientations, they had a current employee who actually could speak both English and that language, and then they would translate during the orientation. So they did not require that employee to speak English, but they were able to, as long as they had a translator in-house. I wasn't part of that whole interview process, but I sat through some of those orientations. So it does definitely raise a challenge, you know, especially with ELL and how you move forward. In David City, we get a lot of families that come in, and like I said, none of them speak any English, and you just have to figure out, hopefully you have an extra pair available to assist in the classroom or whatever it might be, but I haven't had to do a lot with that. So, good question. Anybody else?
Who do you report to?
I actually report directly to the owners of the company. We have 3 owners. They own it's 2 brothers and a cousin. And they've been, so they're the 3rd generation, and most of them have been there, I think, about 33 to 35 years. John Hughes, our president, Actually, he was just honored and was inducted into the Business Hall of Fame here just about a week ago Thursday through the Chamber of Commerce. And he was president of the company when he turned 25, like his dad turned that over to him already. So, like I said, it's a really great organization, but again, being a family-owned business, there are a lot of things that I see different compared to working at a corporate environment like Nestle and Crete. You know, it's good and it's bad. It's good because from a family standpoint, if I've got stuff going on with my kids, they're real generous about, you know, go take care of that, go to their games or whatever. But in a corporate environment, it's pretty by the book as well, so. Okay. Health and safety, again, I'm sure there's certain things that you gotta require and cover in a school environment. Some of the things that we're looking at is obviously personal protective equipment in addition to that. But again, how many of you have a paper shredder in the office? You know, making sure nobody knows to stick their hand in it. If somebody's running a snow blower, they're wearing the eye protection so they don't get anything in their eye. Because those work comp claims are gonna come back and cost your district money. You know, those are the kind of things that can you prevent an injury from occurring? You can't always prevent it because they're called accidents. Accidents occur. But what can you do to prevent those extra costs from being incurred by your district? Slips, trips, and falls. Unfortunately, this time of year, I mean, you try to do about everything you can, but you still end up having people fall on the ice from time to time. You know, and can you show that it was, you know, was it a work-related injury or was it not? So something to think about. Have policies in place for that as well, though. Are they properly reporting? Do you have a policy in place that they need to report it the day that it occurs? We do, because somebody comes to me on a Monday and says, I hurt my back last Friday. We have no way of knowing what they did over the weekend. They might ride horses for fun and they got bucked off a horse. I mean, we don't know. So we do have a policy in place that they do need to properly report or they could be denied benefits. If it's more of a cumulative trauma like carpal tunnel syndrome, that's a little harder to say it happened on this exact day. It could be from just repetitive motion that they have an injury. So we do have a lot of that type of work comp claim in our environment as well. Strategic planning, as I said, is important in my world. I don't know how important it is in education, but all of these things that we've been talking about, planning, recruiting, selection, and all that, really is the process of strategic planning for your organization as well. So even if you may not be doing a lot of succession planning, it really is tying in all those components. This is just a snapshot of some competencies in the HR profession. I'm not going to talk about those in detail. I actually took it from a textbook since I taught some night classes at Concordia University for about 3 years teaching an HR class. So this was just kind of an interesting dynamic pyramid that I pulled out because even in your line of business, I think some of these things could be of interest to you. I do a lot of presentations for like senior seminar groups and some different things like that. And I always find it interesting because they're always like, well, is it hard to fire people? Well, yeah, I mean, who wants to be good at that, right? I mean, not me. You know, and obviously, like I said, with the attendance, those are pretty easy termination meetings to take care of. But who likes to sit down and meet with somebody and pretty much tell them that I'm sorry, you know, you can't work for Hughes Brothers or this school or whatever anymore. It is difficult. And I've had a couple of really tough termination meetings, especially in a situation where we had a gentleman one year who he worked out in our plant. You know, we did an action plan, but not necessarily an action plan with him, but did some extra training because he just couldn't work fast enough. Like he changed jobs, we were doing some things, and he just could never meet the performance goals. And unfortunately, because of some of the mistakes he was making, we have a policy that if you do over, I think it's $1,000 in damage to product or machines, it requires a write-up. And so right before Christmas, I had to let this guy go. I mean, it was like the hardest meeting ever. And after he got done, I had to honestly close my door and let some tears flow because I felt so horrible that I had to fire this guy right before Christmas. But again, it's just part of the job, you know. And that's the one thing I think that's really hard sometimes too is it's hard not to get emotional because it's such, you know, if you're like me, you get so invested in what you're doing on a daily basis and you have such a passion for what you're doing, it's hard not to get emotional. And so sometimes I do have to remind myself, especially in those difficult meetings, you know, write everything down that you want to talk about. Stay on script so you know I want to cover points A, B, C, and D, because if you don't, you're going to become too emotional during that meeting. So that's one thing that I like to do is kind of script my meeting discussion so that it can keep me on task and make sure that I'm not going off a tangent and kind of keep my emotions in check sometimes as well. Anybody else have any questions on that? Okay. How are we doing on time? You want me to?
Keep going,
Okay.
5 o'clock.
I don't think, they might be throwing tomatoes at me if I'm here that long. Through the different 20 years of HR, I've gone to a lot of different training sessions as well, and leadership seminars, management seminars, things of that nature. So kind of these next set of slides are kind of a combination of some of those things that I've picked up, things that I guess have retained as I'm going through that. So first and foremost, being a leader is not the same as being a manager, but I do think in human resources you have to be both. And we've talked about a lot of those examples already. So the definition here would be managers create order out of complexity, they keep the trains running on schedule, but leaders here in this situation, they're going to be able to deal more with the ambiguity and the change and the things of that nature to take the train where it's never gone before. I'm sorry that's a little dark on the screen there, but some of the characteristics I think of an effective leader too are being caring, being comfortable with those unknown details, being persistent, being a good communicator, and being a good negotiator. Obviously in schools, again, you have the Teachers Education Association that you have to negotiate the contract and the wages with, and having a good working relationship is important. I found that in this union environment compared to where I was at Friskies is it's much more enjoyable when you have a good working relationship with those people who are negotiating the contract. Because if it's hostile every day, it doesn't make it real fun to sit down at the table and negotiate those things. Some other things here, being politically astute. Again, you know, being new as a superintendent, for example, especially if you're going into a new district for that first time as a superintendent, there's a lot of things that you have to get to know. And like I said, being that I've been through this with my husband, that first year, I'm not kidding, that he probably called me 2 or 3 times a week in my office because he would be coming up with something else. That, okay, let me run this by you or whatever it might be. I do kid him because he saves his school district a lot of money being married to me because I'm able to help him through some of those tough situations. But I'm not afraid to know what my limitations are and say, call your attorney. And I'm sure most of you have seen the news, for example, Chad Fuller, their assistant principal, who is a paraplegic right now, is making it really kind of interesting right now because they're at the point right now where they have to determine, are they going to sever his contract for next year, or are they going to be able to accommodate those, be able to meet all those accommodation requests that he has. And so that's what they're right in the middle of right now. Yes, ma'am.
This made me think, is your husband the head of HR in his district too?
See, in small school districts, there is no HR department.
Okay, we have a panel coming up, so that's why I was wondering why. Okay.
Yeah, Lincoln and Omaha are fortunate because you actually have HR people within your school district. I don't know how many of you probably can answer that. I mean, pretty much your superintendent is your HR director too, for the most part, because they're responsible for helping to make sure all those hires and all that are in place, your policies, your regulations, and so forth. But in a lot of those smaller school districts, there is no HR person, right? I mean, unless you could probably agree to, yeah. Okay. So other characteristics, again, being humorous sometimes, like I said, I do have to try to lighten the situation up sometimes because whatever that situation is for a student, a parent, a staff member, again, they're going to come in, rearing to go, and sometimes you just kind of have to, breathe a little bit, let's calm down, and we'll talk about this rationally. I've had a few employees that have stormed into my office and just start yelling at me. And that's kind of the first thing I do, and I don't yell, but because usually I'm sitting and they come storming into my office because I'm right up front by the desk. I'll stand up and I'll kind of like stop, and they'll, stop, and if they're still yelling, they'll stop, and then sit down. I just literally have to say, you need to take a breath, or we're not going to continue this meeting. I am not going to let you yell at me until you calm down. So there's, not that happens very often, but sometimes it does. And I'm sure, unfortunately, most of the time you're getting calls from parents on the phone and it's kind of hard to get them to calm down. They just want to scream, but same type of thing there. Anybody else have a question? Again, being level-headed, being calm when can, engaging, being challenging. Like I said, there's a lot of things here, being self-aware, future-focused. I mean, that's the one thing is you always have to be thinking ahead. If something does happen, are you going to be able to deal with it within your organization? Like I said, I'm doing a lot of planning right now since I see that there's going to be a lot of holes to fill in the next 3 to 5 years. Most important, I think, is being adaptable. All of those things that I mentioned, because like I said, if you can't deal with change, you're not gonna be very successful, no matter what position you're in, whether it's out on the plant floor, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a coach, whether it's a principal. I mean, you have to be able to adapt to change as well. And this is just a snapshot I like to share with a lot of the high school kids that I meet with, and I actually have it posted on my bulletin board. I actually had it laminated and gave it to my boys and said, put this in your locker. Because one of the things that we reinforce at home with our kids, attitude and effort. Attitude and effort are the two things that I tell them, no matter what you do, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's in your sports, whatever it might be, are gonna impact everything you do. Those things impact your behavior. And so I just like to share this because I think it does speak into any particular job itself, especially as I'm hiring employees. What are the things that we want from them? We want to see that these 10 things they're able to help us with as well. Again, you can't always know that, and I've been buffaloed. I've hired a few people that said all the right things in the interview, did all the right things. They passed their 60-day probationary period in flying colors. Day 61, then I start having problems, right? Now they're under contract because they passed probation, and now I gotta go through all the steps. So like I said, some people do know what to say and can get their foot in the door, but again, if they don't have some of these other characteristics, it's gonna show up in a hurry that you're gonna be able to see that they're not gonna be able to be the star employee that you want them to be. All right. So other than me getting you a list of sample interview questions, is there anything else from a resource perspective that somebody wanted to see that I did not include? I have a couple, like I said, sample posters out there, some family medical leave certifications. I didn't really bring that up when we were talking about benefits, but those are critical for you to make sure if somebody comes in with a serious medical condition and needs time off, that you have the family medical leave certification filled out by their doctor. It protects not only you, but that employee as well. So that's a key one that we did not discuss.
In a case, without getting specific about Chad Fuller, what are the variables in making that decision of, do you stick with that person and accommodate them, or do you say, no, we can't?
Okay, the key factor is what is a reasonable accommodation? And under the law, under the Americans with Disability Act, it defines for you, what is that definition of reasonable. And what I mean by that is, in a school environment, you have to consider that you have some budgetary constraints. So, you can use that financial hardship definition in helping to make that determination. And I'm just gonna give you a couple examples because, for example, one of the things that potentially may need to happen in Chad Fuller's situation is because he is a quadriplegic, he cannot feed himself, he has a colostomy bag, he cannot push an elevator button, he cannot drive a car, so they have to look at what is reasonable to allow him to come back. One of the requests might be, we want your nurse to feed him and change his colostomy bag. Well, is that really reasonable? Is that really that school nurse's job to do that? And again, that's why I tell my husband, call the attorney because they're gonna be able to find case law that's gonna help you determine what that is. Okay, one of the jobs for his particular position is to evaluate some staff members and coaches. Well, you probably could record that class lesson, bring that back, do a text-to-voice software to be able to probably type those notes up. But if you guys have a particular software that you use to do those evaluations, who's gonna enter that data? So then the question is do you have to hire another para or another staff member who basically is going to shadow him all day long in order to do those functions that he cannot perform by himself? It is reasonable to say that we need to give him more time to get to Bellwood or across the street to the elementary if he has duties over there, because just because he's in a wheelchair, that is reasonable. But again, he can't drive, so who transports him? So you can see how complex this particular situation is, because if he doesn't regain any movement at all in any of his hands, what's reasonable? And that's really where they're at right now. And I'll be honest, he's actually, the good news is that he did regain a little bit of movement in one hand and on one side of the shoulder, that he can actually shrug his shoulders now. And so they're trying to get him back into Madonna to try and continue that rehab, because he wasn't making progress. So Madonna, when you're done making progress, they usually boot you out pretty quickly. So he has until the April board meeting to see what other progress is being made right now. And then at that point, he can't really wait much longer to determine what you are or not gonna be able to do. I mean, it's just a difficult situation no matter what.
Right.
Because you feel bad because, I mean, it wasn't his fault that that happened, but you also can't hold the job open for 2 years hoping that he'll be able to come back at that time. Because right now, we have an interim principal, Steve Borer, who's filling in right now, but I don't believe Steve will be doing it next year, so I don't know.
Tough situation.
I don't know, I hope it doesn't get too ugly, I mean, because it could be, no matter what. Any other questions? Oh, anybody that wants a business card, I can pass that box around if you would. If you have other questions, email me directly. I'm happy to help if you have something that comes up. I know there's been some prior classes that I've talked to that people were working on some different things that, I don't even remember what they came in, did an interview with me for one of their projects or something like that. So if you have something going on, by no means, I'm not an attorney, I'm not an expert, but I'm willing to give you my advice and what I've done in those situations.
Anybody?
Okay, thank you.